Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Live from the Blue Seats. It's just me, producer JL, coming at you this week with another short discussion about New York Rangers hockey that totally doesn't involve the team blowing late period leads and making us look really bad. Well, even though that's an interesting way to start the episode, we obviously have to touch on what ended up happening since we last recorded. So, we recorded just around the time before the end of the Western Conference trip. And, well, let's just say that first game was the second game rather, was an absolute disaster. And they just narrowly avoided another disaster against the San Jose Sharks. So basically, just a quick summary of road trip was they lost 3-1. Not a total terrible effort against the LA Kings after winning 5-3 against the Vancouver Canucks, and what many feel was essentially a stolen win on Sam Rosen on afternoon. Then um, they played the Anaheim Ducks. They had a lead going into the third period, basically a lead towards the end of the period where they could have just easily gotten another 2 points. But ultimately, they only were able to get the one after just completely melting down at the end. The Ducks just took over within the final, 5 minutes in overtime of the game. And it's a little embarrassing. Well, not a little embarrassing. It's very embarrassing, rather, that the Rangers even subjected themselves to that after basically controlling 95% of the game. But 95% doesn't exactly mean completion, you know? It's kind of like Mark and Cold Harbor and Severance, you know? Towards the end of the last episode, he had 96% on the Cold Harbor file. The work is important and mysterious. If you haven't seen Severance, you have no idea what I'm talking about. So, and then obviously the next day they go up to San Jose and they redeem themselves by scoring, 6 goals in a 6-1 game, 6-1 win against a team that they should have beaten. And then fast forward to Wednesday, April 2nd. So now the calendar turns to April. You've only got basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games remaining in the schedule. So this will obviously be released before the Rangers match up against the New Jersey Devils. I have no idea what's going on or what's happening in that game. So if you're listening to this either while the game is going on or before it happens or as it's happening, I have no clue what's happening. But so the Rangers have about 7 games remaining on their schedule. And their last game was a 5-4 overtime win against the Minnesota Wild. Again, another encouraging effort, highlighted by wonderful play in overtime, but just a litany of mistakes. Now, we don't generally try to get into the every recap sort of thing here on this podcast, but I just want to point out a couple of things on that Minnesota game that kind of caught my eye. Um, so Vincent Trocheck is having a very up and down season, and some may call it lazy. He just looks off, and I really think that the broken bone in his finger is really affecting him. Whether or not that constitutes him making stupid and bonehead plays, like the one thing that really stuck out to me the most was Rangers had a power play, and Trocheck was just kind of dilly dallying around at center ice for some reason. And me sitting in the stands, I was absolutely heated when that happened because it's saying, well, what are you doing, Trocheck? Like, just move the puck, move it around, do something with it. And I guess maybe he didn't want to turn it over or do something drastic. But in that aspect, you ended up doing the thing you didn't want to do, just in another form. So there was that. And then there was the Keandre Miller turnover that started the third period where the Rangers had a lead, and then he kind of tried to clear it out, and that's ultimately what made it a tie game. There were a lot of positives, though. Obviously, Gabriel Perreault played his first game as a New York Ranger, and let me tell you, he looks like the real deal. Now, I know there's only one game, but there's many, 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 many more opportunities for him to show what he's got. But the one thing I've noticed about him that was different than other rookies that I've seen that have come up is that he has the vision for the ice. We talk about it often, and we allude to it, and we mention it, we say this and we say that about Perot. I even wrote a piece about Gabriel Perot that basically said that this kid is the real deal, and the fact that the Rangers prospects in the system are way more skilled than they were, let's say, even 6 years ago, so to speak. The organization over the last 10 years has made a pivot to finding a way to develop players, in a much better fashion. Well, and maybe some of those haven't really turned out as well as we wanted to, but you have to give at least the Rangers credit for attempting to try and get more skill-based players instead of players that are just kind of hit a peak. There was someone I was talking to. I can't remember who this was, but they made a really good point when it came to the Rangers drafting prospects back in like the say their early Gordon days, and what they're doing now is that they're drafting guys now who have a higher ceiling in the sense that they're not that they're total reclamation projects, but you look at a guy like Perot, for example. Perot, he's got incredible vision. He's got great hands, wonderful passing ability, including, the pass he made the other night off the rip to Alexis Lafreniere, and Lafreniere was so thrown off by it that he fell on his own feet. Nice hands, feet, you know. And then there were a couple other instances where the Rangers just kind of either shot it wide or kind of, missed the opportunity, and Perot was kind of really making himself known. Definitely was not invisible. But if you take a look at some of the other prospects that they picked back in the day, you can really only probably point out a handful of prospects within the span of like 2008 to 2015, I would assume. I don't have a list in front of me right now, which maybe I should, but the only two that really kind of pop in my head, I'll look that up because I don't want to make sure I want to make sure I don't miss anything. But one of the players that I noticed that kind of got away from the typical Rangers mold was JT Miller. And the thing is that with Miller at the time when the Rangers picked at him. Excuse me, not. I had to catch myself there for a second. Picked at him. For some reason, I'm thinking picketing. I apologize. It's been a very long day. I just got back from City Field, so I'm a little tired. But I wanted to make sure I gave you guys a podcast for the, I wanted to give you guys a podcast before, the week was over. Picked at it. Oh my gosh, I cannot believe I said that. Goodness gracious. So I'm looking at some of the picks right now. So I'm going to start from 2008. So I guess let's just kind of go with this because, if you're listening to this, you definitely have time. Um, so in 2008, the ones that stand out are Michael Del Zotto and Derek Stepan. Dale Weiss was in the system, but he didn't exactly thrive with the Rangers. He ended up thriving elsewhere, outside of the Rangers organization. Thomas Kondratic, same thing, but Chris Doyle, Mitch Galton, and Evgeny Grachev were really nothing. And then 2009, you obviously had Chris Kreider, Ethan Warwick, Ryan Bourque, Roman Horak, Scott Stager, Daniel Maggio, and Mikhail Pashinin. Um, Only really one of those actually panned out. Obviously, it's Mr. Four primary assists Kreider. And then 2010, which I think people lost their jobs for this, Dylan McElrath, Christian Thomas, Andrew Yogan, Jason Wilson, Jesper Fast, and Randy McNaught. So clearly, two of those guys ended up playing NHL games for the New York Rangers, and that was Jesper Fast, who that was a pretty good pick, and then Dylan McElrath. And then this 2011 draft, oof, boy, Stephen Fogarty ended up playing some games with the Rangers, but he didn't really stick around too much. But the big one really was JT Miller. And then 2012, I'm not even going to mention the rest of that class because none of them really played for the Rangers or played in the NHL really. 2012 was Brady Shea, Boo Nieves, Callie Anderson, and Thomas Spelling. 2 out of 4. Well, say 1 out of 4 really, because Brady Shea is still in the NHL. Played a handful, more than a handful of games with the Rangers. Did pretty well. He served his purpose here in New York. So funny enough, in 2013, the Rangers did not have a first-round pick, obviously. So their first pick was Adam Tambellini, um, who did not play in the NHL, but then Pavel Buchnevich, Ryan Duclair, Ryan Graves, Anthony Duclair, and even Mackenzie Skapsky all ended up making it to the NHL. That Buchnevich guy, I wonder if we could use a guy like that. And then 2014, Brandon Halverson. Um, Keegan Iverson, nowhere to be found. Ryan Mantha. Oh yeah, some guy named Igor Shesterkin. Right. And then Daniel Walcott, Tyler Nane, nothing really much. So I'm just gonna speed this up a little bit. So since 2008, you've had one, two, three, four. I'm not counting Dylan McElrath. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 makes. Okay, no, not in 2015. That was an awful draft. Let's see. No, not 2016 either. None of those guys really did anything for the Rangers. 11 Heedle and 12 Morgan Barron to a degree. It wasn't terrible, but it was pretty short-lived. 2018 Kratzov, Keandre Miller, obviously that's a big. So that's another big one. And then obviously Capo Caco. Still surprised Matthew Robertson hasn't played in the NHL yet. Zach Jones. So if you notice, as it gets to the end of the 2018s, 2019s, the Rangers prospect pool tends to get a little bit better. They drafted Adam Edstrom in 2019. They drafted Zach Jones in 2019. Obviously Capo Caco in 2019. So that was pretty good. And then this is when it starts to get a little bit better. We, Alexi Lafreniere. Say what you want about the kid. He's still got a bunch of skills, still pretty useful at this moment. Braden Schneider, Will Cooley, Brett Berard, Matthew Rempe, and Dylan Garand is definitely still somebody that's going to be in the system still. And Hugo Olas is definitely still fighting for a spot in Hartford. And then you got in 21 the first draft for Chris Drury, Brennan Othman, and then obviously Yaroslav Hemlash, I think that's how you say it, is doing pretty well. Um, I don't think Hank Kempf is with the organization anymore. Brody Lamb is there, Ryder Korzak. I've heard a lot of good things about Brody Lamb. I'm not really sure about the rest of the players in this 21 draft, but definitely Othman is the one that stands out. So if you really think about it, just looking from, we're gonna go with 20. So we'll not include, include 2020. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So out of all the players, well, 17, I'll include Chris Kreider, 17, and then 18, 19, Delzato, and Stepan. So you have 19 players from 2008 all the way until 2019, 2020 that really stuck out. And the point I'm trying to make is that, the Rangers, the way they pick prospects is different now. And you would think that an organization that, you would think that there would have been more, let's just say, because other teams, and maybe I'm being a little bit too much with this, but the point I'm trying to make with Perreault is that the kid's got great vision. He looks incredible out there. This is the first time in a long time outside of Lafreniere and Capo Caco that, you know, a prospect has really come in and like made a noticeable difference. Obviously, you can point to Chris Kreider scoring his first goal in the playoffs, and then you can also point to Derek Stepan scoring a hat trick in his first game, or Michael Delzato scoring a goal. I want to say that was the first game at the Garden. I might be wrong. Um, but either way, he looked great. And the organizational philosophy and the point I was going to make is that the Rangers are not just getting players who it's not bad to take players who already have hit sort of a ceiling, but if you notice within the list that I was mentioning, a lot of those players kind of were already at a point where they were like just there was really not much more growth in terms of the type of player that they were, with the exception of a few. But when you got a guy like Gabriel Perreault, even though he may have, he's not the greatest skater in the world, but the kid has the IQ and the passing ability just to make up for it. And that's ultimately what you want in a prospect like Gabriel Perreault, because then what he does is he can complement a guy like an Alexis Lafreniere, who really does have that higher end skill for a number one overall pick, or even a guy like a Brendan Othman who has a really good shot and can really get into the tough, gritty areas, and then even a guy like, for like a guy like a Brett Berard, who's going to be sort of, you know, sort of gritty, in your face nose type guy. You need guys like Perot to be able to dish it around. That's one of the things that this team doesn't really have are playmakers, like really like legitimate playmakers. Playmakers. Obviously, you have JT Miller, Adam Fox, of course, Panarin to a degree, but Panarin is really more of a shooter than anything. But somebody who can make a really good dish. And maybe I'm speaking out of turn in the sense that maybe I'm misevaluating some of the players on the team, but outside of Fox, Miller, maybe Trocheck, and Panarin on a good night when he's not trying to shoot the puck into oblivion, which I like, there's not really many playmakers on that team who can make a nifty pass. Like I was looking, and there was one play in particular. I can't remember too much of it, but Perot was in the corner. No, no, Perot wasn't in the corner. Perot was in his defensive zone right in front of the blue line, and he made a pass right to like he was basically looked like he was covered, but he made a pass to one of the guys that was coming out of the zone, and it felt seamless. And then there was another time where I think Perot was in the corner of the offensive zone, and he made a nice little pass to get out of the corner to set up a play. And there were a couple of instances where the team was able to, get a chance from Perot, but they didn't bury it. But again, Gabriel Perot looked great. He was very noticeable. He was very active along the play, looked great playing with JT Miller and Alexis Lafreniere. And I really think that if the organization is really going to commit to having JT Miller as their guy, as the number one guy, at least for this team, then I think Gabriel Perreault was like his perfect wingman because he kind of complements a lot of what Perreault is missing. Perreault's a kid. JT Miller is a grizzled veteran who's tougher, who's bigger. He can get into the corners. He's the type of guy that you want to learn from. He has that experience. So I think that'll be really good. And then Alexis Lafreniere is just basically pure skill. Could Lafreniere become a better skater? Absolutely. But, good thing there's the off season for that. So all in all, that game against Minnesota, there were a lot of positives. Obviously, Artemi Panarin just looked like gangbusters, was absolutely killing it. And even though Vincent Trocheck made a couple of lazy plays, was able to bank home the overtime winner to really put the Rangers in good position for a playoff spot. Even though, as I record this, they are currently 2 points out. It could have been a lot worse if they had decided to let it go and not keep competing. And then if you just kind of look at the rest of the Rangers schedule, which I'll pull up in a second, which I thought I had it up, but I guess I took it off. But the rest of the Rangers schedule is sort of a mix between good and bad teams, but it's not exactly the worst, but it's not the greatest either, because they do have to play a couple of in-division teams and a couple of teams in the Eastern Conference. So we'll just take a quick look at that if my computer decides to actually load the page. It's 2025, folks. I wish computers were a bit quicker than what they have, or I just maybe don't have a good computer. So the rest of the schedule goes, obviously, they play New Jersey at 12:30 at the Prudential Center. That's the final matchup between those two. A team that's going into the playoffs essentially on one foot. Then Monday on the 7th, they play the Tampa Bay Lightning, which that's going to be a fun one, depending on whether you want to see either a team surprise you or a glutton for punishment. And then obviously on Wednesday, the 9th, there is that 7:30 game, a nationally televised game against the Philadelphia Flyers. That's going to be a special game because that will be the game that Sam Rosen and John Davidson will broadcast together for one final time as Sam begins to make his curtain call. Then the next day, they hop on a train all the way down somewhere near Ronkonkoma. Probably not. I know Ronkonkoma and Belmont are nowhere near each other. But they hop on the LIRR and they go to the UBS Center where they play the Islanders, which that should also be a good game as the Islanders are still competing for a spot. Then they have a day off on the 11th and go to Carolina for a 3 p.m. game the following Saturday, which also is a big game for the Rangers. And then they hop all the way down south to go play the Florida Panthers at 7 p.m. on Monday the 14th in Sunrise. And then 2 more days off just right after the next pay period in our jobs, at least my job at least, they finish off the season against the Tampa Bay Lightning on the 17th. and that will be the final game of the season. That will also be Sam Rosen's final regular season game as the New York Rangers main play-by-play man. So what does this schedule tell you? Basically, they have to win the majority of the games. It's pretty simple. It's about as simple as that. I think the Devils game is winnable. This is probably going to be the biggest game of the season. You know, um, Obviously, New Jersey is still a very good team. Even though they are missing Jack Hughes, they are missing Dougie Hamilton, they're missing a bunch of players that could really affect them. They're still a very solid team. Luke Hughes is still pretty good on the back end. Nico Heischer, Timo Meyer, they're not pushovers. Their bottom six is, as much as I like to rag on the Devils not having any depth, they've been able to hold their own for a bit. And even though they're slipping, the Rangers can't take them lightly. And one of the things I've noticed about this team is that they kind of tend to look down on opponents. They do something that the New York Mets used to do a lot, was kind of look down on your opponent a little bit, but they can't do that. They are fighting for their lives. So I think that the Rangers could potentially win against New Jersey on this is going to be released later today on Friday, but they can win on that Saturday. The Tampa Bay Lightning game is going to be a bit tough. It just all kind of depends on how this team responds. The Philadelphia Flyers game should be a win, so to speak. Obviously, they thought you were going to win against the Anaheim Ducks, and that changed. But and then obviously the Islanders, they should also be able to win that game. So ultimately, they can go to next week with a chance of still being in the playoffs. And you also hope that Montreal, you also hope that Columbus, you know, uh, Montreal, Columbus, Detroit, or as they like to say up in Michigan and in Ontario, Detroit, they are pretty much out of it. And you would hope that, the Panthers probably won't go full bore. Maybe Alexander Barkov is not in the lineup. He's injured as I say this. Maybe something has changed by the time this comes out. But the Panthers are just a different machine. And then obviously the Tampa Bay Lightning again. So hopefully what you envision, at least as a Ranger fan, is that they can beat the Devils, beat the Flyers, beat the Islanders, and hopefully maybe squeeze one out against the Hurricanes. And if they're able to do that, that should be enough to kind of put the Rangers over the hump. Now, look, I'm Mr. Optimistic. I think that this team is still going to make the playoffs, even though my confidence is, waning by the day. This is a pretty pivotal moment in this team's season right now. You know, Obviously we already know that we talked about it ad nauseum. They squandered a ton of opportunities. Between November and December, and then kind of went gangbusters in January, early February, and then just kind of came out flat and still found a way to kind of resurrect themselves and keep themselves into the picture. So you just hope that these guys kind of put it together after a bit and just kind of say, hey, we need to put up or shut up because this team's going to look a lot different coming into the summer. Whether or not big contracts get traded, Kreider's gone, Zibanejad's gone, Zibanejad stays. I mean, who knows, honestly. But at this point, it's just something that you really have to kind of take into account. So, but I'm definitely excited to see how this team looks. I'm hoping Zibanejad will play against the Devils because he was not at practice today. He had Parsonen filling in for him. Hopefully, that changes and I see Zibanejad go out on the ice tomorrow. Um, but you just hope. And now with baseball season starting, and the NHL regular season is getting ready to wrap up, you just hope that they can pull through. That's what you want. I know a lot of people aren't too thrilled with the team. And I'm not too. I mean, they really did this to themselves, but you just hope that they can find a way to pull through. Because look, let's be real here. Yeah, they're not the greatest team in the world. They're very fractured, but you won't you. I don't think anyone would be upset if they made the playoffs. Granted, what they decide to do in the playoffs is now an entirely different story if that ends up becoming the thing. But at the end of the day, I think every fan wants to see their team go into the playoffs. And I think that will be good for not only the team, but also just for us as well. And look, So I know someone I know mentioned that they didn't want their ticket prices to go up when if they made the playoffs because the report came out that if the Rangers not miss the playoffs this year, the season tickets are going to go up. And look, I know that that applies to me because I think I have a quarter plan. I had 11 games. So look, whether it's a I don't think it's going to be a huge increase. Then again, I could be wrong, but I think I'm willing to take that bet on my tickets going up slightly because the Rangers made the playoffs. That's a gamble I'm willing to take. Honestly, I don't think at least with my plan, I don't think it's going to be exorbitant. So, but then again, I could possibly be surprised. But even if I am surprised, I don't care because I wouldn't do it if I knew I couldn't afford it. Obviously, for other people, it might be a different story, so I'm not going to judge. But you know, I think it'll all be for. I think it'll just be good for this team to see that they were able to persevere through a really bad stretch and basically kind of pull it out. And once the playoffs come, look, listen, you had teams that basically scratched and clawed their way into the playoffs and were able to do damage. You never know what can happen with this team, you know. Then again, I err on the side of positivity. Dave is just straight. I hate these guys. And look, I understand that because I understand the rationale of this being one of the worst teams to root for because a lot of people find them unlikable, especially what happened with the whole Goodrow and Trouba thing. I get that. I understand that completely. And that's part of the source of my frustration is that this team essentially quit on us, the fans, and on themselves for a bit, for not just a bit, for almost a month and a half, 2 months. And you got, hardworking people like myself and other season ticket members who, you know, who put their hard-earned money into wanting to see something that's, not their daily jobs, and they come out with those duds. So ultimately, at the end of the day, they did this to themselves. And, you hope that now they've been able to say, they've been able to look at each other and say, guys, this is not great. And obviously, getting rid of Truba, getting rid of Goodrow, getting rid of Lindgren, getting rid of Kako, it really did help to a degree, even though a lot of the players weren't fans of it, but it made the team better on and on paper. They just have to not put up or shut up. So with that being said, we're approaching about 27 minutes, and if you made it this far, congratulations. I applaud you for listening to me ramble on and yammer on for a bit. I just wanted to say, and this is just me being appreciative. I thank you guys for taking the time out, whether it's just me rambling on about something or we have the whole crew here. I want to thank everyone who listens to the show. You guys are awesome. We love getting your feedback. We love getting your questions and comments and concerns. We love seeing the stuff you put on the blog when we post articles. It's that keeps us going. We have a, a suite of solid contributors on this website. I could sit here and name all of them, but you know who they are. And credit to not only the contributors to the website, but also, hats off to Dave. Dave has a lot to deal with just generally, with the website and, us and other things and, his family life and, his work life and whatever. But, I give him credit for really being on the ball and putting, this out and also allowing me the opportunity to really do this. I'm a broadcaster by trade. I went to school for it. I do play by play. I edit, I do a bunch of stuff. If you're looking for a play by play, give me a call. I'm totally serious. But Dave gives us this space to, express our feelings and thoughts about the New York Rangers. And, he does a really good job himself with his Patreon and all the other parts of the website. So I thank you to him. I thank him and Dave's awesome. We go back and forth about our cookie takes and our me calling him old, and him being Abe Simpson. But Dave's a really good guy, and you couldn't ask for a better group of contributors to follow along with him as well. So I'm very privileged to be here, and it's just great that I get to do this. And and then you look at Rob and Becky and Connell and Suit and Russell and Hope and Tyler. and I'm sorry if I miss anyone else's name, but everyone that's, a contributor to this website, Nick and, and also to the 30 on Broadway guys, they're awesome. Those guys are, great. We have a lot of back and forth going. Hopefully you're feeling better, Chris, by the way. I know hurting your leg is not exactly the most ideal thing, but hope you're doing all right, Chris. But anyways, so now we've approached the 30-minute mark. That being said, I think that's just about it. You hope that the New York Rangers can give us something to really write home about. Like I said, I'm a natural optimist. I think that this team is going to do well. You would think that me being a Mets fan, I wouldn't be a natural optimist, but guess what? I am. But, you know, the frustration, what I was going to say before uh, I forget. I understand a lot of people's frustrations, and Dave in particular, really does not like this team, and it can be seen as sort of an unlikable team. And I remember the last team that I don't really hate these guys, but it is a bit difficult to watch at times, obviously. And I was gonna allude to, I just remembered again because I'm talking and the thought like went out of my head. The last time I can honestly say that I mean, I enjoy watching hockey generally, but there's been a bit of a sour taste in the mouth this season. So the last time I really felt that way, but I really disliked this team more than the current iteration, was the 2015-2016 New York Rangers. And I do not know how this team got 100 points that season. That was probably the worst 100-point team I've ever seen. And they didn't even win the President's Trophy that year, for goodness sake. This is the season following the President's Trophy. So, um, but that was the year that they traded for Eric Stahl. They misused him. They misused Keith Yandel, which for some reason everybody in the Rangers at that time, at least Alain Vigneault, thought that Keith Yandel was a bottom pair defenseman on the second power play unit. I mean, seriously? Is that what we're getting at here? Is this what we're doing here, guys? Really? So, and then, it just, they had traded Hagelin, and they thought Emerson Edom was going to be the guy. Obviously, Edom had all the speed, but the guy couldn't put one into the back of the net to save his life. And, they just, it was just a very weird, slow, and I don't want to say unlikable, just a boring team. And Henrik Lundqvist really bailed them out. And you would think, oh, you have like Rick Nash and Derek Stepan and Derek Brassard, but it's like, damn Boyle, like they were just kind of stagnant. And the fact that they made the playoffs that year only to get torched by the Penguins who ended up winning the Stanley Cup that year, it was kind of sucky, man. And I know I'm being very casual with that phrase. It was not fun. So I don't get a similar feeling here. I can understand why people would feel the way that they do, like I felt about that 15-16 team. But anyways, so we're getting on 32 minutes. I just had to make sure I got that thought out before I forgot. Um, but thank you to everyone who's listening. Thank you to the Patreon subscribers, to the bloggers, to Dave, to Rob, to everyone that helps contribute, whether you're a commenter, a listener, a viewer, a writer, a contributor, whatever. I thank you, and we'll see you next time on Live from the Blue Seats. And maybe Dave will be back. Hopefully he feels better. Hopefully Rob feels better too, where Dave can come on and essentially give us another crappy cookie take. Anyways, this has been Live from the Blue Seats. Thank you so much for taking the time out to listen. We'll see you guys next week. Adios.